Hello everyone, and welcome to week 5 of the workshop. So this week we're going to be diving into specular and reflection maps, as well as a bunch of different other maps I like to paint that will drive certain qualities of the skin that you don't typically do from a general standpoint, whether it's for games or just hobbyist work. These extra maps we kind of always do in production. It's kind of a standard for us. So before I actually dive into some painting, I want to go through and talk a little bit about reflection versus specularity. I think it's kind of a confusing topic, especially because every studio uses your quote-unquote spec map differently. So some studios will use a combination of your maps to be plugged in as specularity qualities, or they'll use the maps and plug them in as reflection quality. So the easiest way to think about this is that if your spec map, and we're just going to call them spec maps because that's what most people identify them with, if you take your spec map and plug it in as a spec map, it's really just a cheat, and it's always been a cheat ever since the invention of specularity, to cheat the sense of the environment being reflected in and on the surface. Whereas a reflection map is a true reflection map, so it will reflect the environment around it. And it also depends on the renderer you use. A lot of times people will use specularity maps as specularity maps in terms of the component they plug it in for spec, because it's cheaper, as opposed to taking your spec map and plugging it in as reflection. It has to calculate the reflection and the environment on the surface. So for instance, at ILM, when I was there, we would use a combination of both. So we would have one map that we plug in for specularity that will actually isolate and reflect the highlight of whatever source light there is, and then we'll have the specularity map, whether it's the same map or a slightly tweaked one, that's plugged in for reflection, so it can actually reflect the environment on the glancing angles and such. And having those separated, you can do a lot of further tweaking independently of each other to get a desired result. Whereas some studios will just use pure reflection because the renderer they use doesn't really matter, and it's not costly at all. Whereas on the flip side, other studios will use just specularity because it is a little bit more expensive. So it's kind of a ambiguous topic. Long story short, so for our purposes, we're going to paint these, and it really doesn't matter. The term reflection and specularity, they're kind of interchangeable at this point because we're not going to be doing any real look dev. So for our purposes, we're just going to call them spec maps. But we will be painting, as I said earlier, some other types of masks that will drive other qualities of the skin that we want to achieve. So I brought up a couple faces. They're all different lighting environments, all different types of skin, and some of them obviously more photoshopped than others. So you're getting a little bit more perfection, for instance, from this photo versus this photo here. But the things I want to talk about are the qualities of the skin, basically the oiliness and the shininess of the skin, and where those things tend to pick up in areas of the face. And again, if you look from photo to photo, it's very different. So her lips are very glossy, probably because she has gloss on her lips. However, his lips are very dry. And this can be an interesting look, but for the most part, we want to make sure that there's a little bit of wetness on the lips, unless it's for a specific need. But as you can see, a little bit more oily around the eyes, definitely in the ears, on the nose, forehead, cheeks. Anywhere that's going to be shinier is basically going to have more oil from what your skin secretes on your face. So identifying these areas before you paint are going to be key when you're actually doing your painting. Whereas opposed to this is probably a little bit too far. Even though this is a realistic photo with no touch-up, her skin is very oily, almost to the point where it looks kind of wet. Obviously we don't want to go that far, but it's good to have this reference here just in case for future uses. It's really good to see the skin in as many environments and lighting conditions and qualities as you can, just get it kind of for a mental bank for future projects or future assets that you're painting, to keep things fresh and unique. And her face is interesting because this is obviously not a touched up photo, but she has makeup on. But you can still identify very shiny areas on the tip of the nose, obviously the glossy lips, a little bit inside the nose, definitely in the ears, cheeks, typical T-zone of the face is where you're looking for. So let's get started and let's paint some spec maps. So here are the color maps where we left them. And these are going to work really well for us. So I now want to take this and convert it into spec, and this is traditionally how we do things. We'll paint the color maps and convert them into spec. So it's going to be no different in this process, and these tutorials for this week are going to be a little bit more straightforward because it's stuff that some of you have probably already done, which is okay. It's always good to reiterate things. So I'm going to actually take this color map folder, this channel, and I'm going to duplicate it. You can either right click copy, right click paste, or just Control C, Control V. And this is going to copy and paste everything in this layer. I'm going to call this base spec. We're going to go in here and check this out. So I'm going to ditch all this subsurface stuff that we painted because we're not going to need that. And for now I'm going to hide the eyebrows. I'm going to hide the veins. I'm going to basically strip this down to just the base color. What I'm trying to do is I just want to find the flat color that we started with. There we go. It's a bit closer to what we want. There. So it's essentially just this tile skin paintable that we're looking for to start with. The reason I stripped all this out is because I want to make sure it's as even as possible for a base. So we're not actually, when we do a levels correction, we're not actually correcting with some of the ambient occlusion we have in there, some of the ZBrush. We want to do that independently, layer by layer. So nothing gets too crunched and we don't start darkening areas that we don't really want darkening in. So I'm going to go into this layer stack here. I'm going to take the saturation all the way down and then take this levels adjustment. I can get rid of that color correction. And then this one as well. And I want to take this levels. So the goal here is to get a nice range from dark to light. Because we need this range in here for look development purposes. So they have enough to work with, or if you're the look dev artist, you have enough to work with. If you don't give enough range, then you're kind of limiting yourself, because in look dev you can always back off. So we want to have a decent range from light to dark. So if I were to color pick this, this is sitting at about 0.168, and then the lightest bit is 0.4. So we could go a little bit further, but I'm going to leave this for now because this is we don't want to go too crazy for the base. But there's a good range in here from light to dark, and that's all I'm looking for. From here, we're going to layer on a couple things. We can strip out all the saturation, all the color information, the warmth, and the pale tones. We're not going to need that. So here's the ambient occlusion for the face. And that's good where it is. I'm going to take the color balance out. We want to cheat a little bit inside the nose and darken it a little bit because there's always that issue if you're at an angle like this. A specular highlight's going to just ping in there, and it's not always a desirable look. So even though in some of our reference, for instance here, our nose is a little bit shiny in there, we want to cheat that because it always looks a bit better when it's darkened down. I'm going to turn this face lighter on. Yeah, that's okay. I'm going to leave this because it's hitting some of the zones I actually want to hit, the T-zones. So the top of the forehead, the ears, the cheeks, the chin, a little bit of the lips. I'm okay with that. So I'm going to kill this. I don't need this one. This one will be good to tweak even further. So the goal for this base spec is I want to get an even spec. So these shiny areas we're not going to really address just yet. All I'm looking for is to get some of the original color information detail converted into a decent spec map. I'm going to blow that one away, don't need that. So right now I'm pretty happy with this as a base. However, we have to add in some of the details from the fine displacement and slightly for the ZBrush. I like to cheat a little bit that in there. So I'm going to turn this fine disp on. I'm going to crank it up and do a multiply. Actually, let's leave it as an overlay. I'm going to test something here. So I'm going to go into my adjustment stack. I'm going to add a levels like so. Pin that down. So again, I'm just trying to get some of this poor detail in there. Like so. I'm happy with that. And I'm going to shift and hide that mask, because some of those areas that we painted out I actually want to keep in the spec. So now it's going to pick up inside the crevices and it's going to darken them down slightly, and you're getting that nice stuff on the lips. So what's really nice about this technique is that everything's separate, so you can really have full control. And I'm going to actually not hide that. I'm going to remove the layer mask, create a new one, and I want to paint away some of these dark areas that are darkening down too much for my liking. Like so. Get rid of some of that darkness. Another thing to be aware of is you're seeing these kind of serendipitous things happening based off of your displacement and your base spec. These are the things that really add an organic feel. You're getting this dark patch here that I definitely didn't plan for, but it's going to read really nicely in the spec, this patchiness. And this dark line, it's these things that if you make sure your maps are right, you make sure you're using enough resolution, and you're using the right kind of maps, you get a lot of really cool things for free. And that's part of the success I've found in painting organic things, is making sure you're covering all your bases, because in the end when you put it all back together you get some really nice results. And this blotchiness that we see all over the face is really going to add a nice sense of realism, as opposed to projecting this original skin, projecting like skin from a human face such as this and then converting that. So often the conversion makes that look very flat and too even. But if I were to pull away, you see some really nice breakup on this face that is really going to add some nice qualities when rendered. So I'm really happy with that. I'm going to kill all these veins because we don't need those. And then let's pop in the ZBrush and see what that looks like. So I'm actually going to add that in. Some people would say not to, but it's such a subtle thing that's happening, and I like that it's actually accenting the nasolabial fold here, giving that a little bit more shine. The forehead, I think that's going to give a little bit more pop. So sometimes you'll use this, sometimes you won't. This is just an artistic decision on my end. And let me see what that looks like with it doubled up. So now that's too much. And we want to stay away from that. That starts going into the game realm when you start baking in occlusion maps into specularity and color, which we don't want. And there's that fine balance. You don't want to go completely this way because there's a sense of flatness. Even though we have some really nice color variation, there's a sense of flatness here. But just with just a really soft kiss of the ZBrush, we start getting a little bit more interesting things going on. So I'm going to kill that one. And I'm going to take an actual levels on everything. I just want to bring it up a touch. So we're getting more range in there. From light to dark. There we go. And that is your SpecMaps. So we didn't really do much painting. It's just repurposing a lot of the maps, the original layers that we had from the beginning. And as you can see, it's keeping that non-destructive. This makes it very easy to control and keep moving forward. But as you can see, we haven't addressed the T-zones. We haven't addressed the wetness areas. And that's because I want to leave that to different masks that we're going to paint in the next section. So for my purposes, the way I like to do things even at work is paint a spec map that kind of looks like this. Sometimes I may slightly cheat in. So if we were to add a brightness node here and brighten some stuff up, take a mask, hide everything. I may very, very subtly, just to accent it in the masks that we're about to paint, I may sometimes just go in here and on a very broad scale, brighten up some of that T-zone. It's not going to be very noticeable, but sometimes this helps push your stuff in the direction it needs to go. So this is okay to do, even with what we're about to do next. So don't shy away from this. And then I would go into the lips. And just brighten those ever so slightly. It's not a dramatic thing, but it's just going to complement what we're going to do with these masks. Because this spec map is going to drive the general specularity of the skin. So that general specularity, the quality of that is not going to be super sharp and wet. It's going to be a nice broad speck. So having this in there will just brighten that up ever so slightly. So when we do fold in the finer, tighter stuff, it's going to complement nicely. And I'm just going to do it inside the ears too. Again, very slight. Just to achieve a little bit of that oiliness. There we go. These are your completed base spec maps. Actually, I take that back. I want to go back in and quickly do it to some of the eye area. Just around the eyelid. Again, very slight. There. Now we're done. Cool. So these are your base spec maps. In the next section, we're going to go over and discuss the other maps that I typically paint for achieving realistic skin.